Perception feels like reality, but some people consider it just to all be a brain-made construction. And you'll notice I didn't say mind-made, I said brain-made construction, because as we're going to see in the coming weeks, ecological psychology will push back hard and will argue the opposite, that the world gives you more than enough information to perceive it directly. So what is the truth? Is it brain-made? Is it perceived directly? That's one of the things we're going to start tackling with our look at perception. But before we get there, we do have to wrap up our look at attention to see some of those implications of the change blindness phenomenon that we discovered last time. So this is all, again, in service of trying to understand that mysterious, enigmatic thing we call the human mind and just what it is that we do when we do cognition, when we do thinking, when we use our minds. And today we're going to wrap up our look at attention, what grabs our attention, and specifically today with change blindness, what does not grab our attention and what the implications that has for things like sexism, racism, conspiracy theories, fake news, big issues in today's society. So on the schedule for today, our change detection wrap up. Then we're going to start very basic with just the basic fundamentals of what is perception. And then we're going to delve into one of the big dichotomies of perception. It used to be a huge debate. Now it's more of a accepted dichotomy, but we're going to take a look at the concept of top-down processing in perception versus bottom-up processing. All right, so let's get going on our wrap-up and look at change detection. So just to refresh your memory, last time we left off with a look at the door study by Simons and Levin, and we looked specifically at the results of two versions of the door study. So in the first version, in the bottom right-hand corner there, you can see the two individuals that were switched for each other. So it was that classic asking for directions. The door passes between the two people having a conversation. The person asking for directions switches out with one of the people carrying the doors, and we see if the person giving directions notices it. And when it was those two in the bottom right-hand corner dressed as typical civilians on a university campus, the percentage of subjects that noticed a change in the two age groups, 20 to 30-year-olds versus 35 to 65-year-olds, well, 100% of the 20 to 30-year-old subjects noticed a change, and 0% of the 35 to 65-year-old subjects noticed a change. And it was when those two individuals were dressed as civilians. So Simons and Levin ran a second study where they tested with the same individuals, but this time they were dressed as construction workers. And when they were stopping 20 to 30-year-olds on a university campus, so typically they were stopping students on a university campus, before those 20 to 30-year-olds, 100% of them noticed the change. But now that they were dressed as construction workers, only 33% of them noticed the change. So the question that we left you with was, how might this affect, maintain, perpetuate racism, sexism, fake news, conspiracy theories, etc.? And the hint that we were left with was that in this case, it seems that you are more likely to notice changes between people that are in group, that is identified as being part of the group that you belong to, versus out group individuals. So any thoughts on that? Any speculations, theories as to what might be going on? Yep.
If you're on one side of an argument and you decide to hone in on one specific point that is widely believed that the other side makes, but that was an old thing, and it's just you generalize everyone that way, like, hey, if something, this bad thing is happening, you're responsible. They might not notice we don't do that anymore, we don't think that anymore, you know, they might just stay steadfast in what they believe the other person is.
Okay, so if you're on one side of an argument and you have people on the other side of an argument, so you are, let's say, on side A, which would put you in group A, and then you believe the other people are on side B, which puts them in group B, and then you're saying that you stick to their old arguments and generalize that that's still what they believe in, even if they've changed their arguments, so you're less likely to update your information
Or less willing as well.
or less willing. So let's pursue that a little bit further. So why might you be less likely to update that information, or less willing to update it?
You might have a bias against them and don't want to accept anything positive, like, oh, they realized they were wrong and change.
Mm-hmm.
But that's against my perception of Group B as a whole. So I'm just going to ignore that.
Okay, so you're going to ignore the information, and we're almost there. We almost tied it into this change detection attention sort of phenomenon of it. What might be another way of saying that you ignore information?
You avoid it and don't maybe avoid hearing about anything.
You avoid hearing about it. Do you give it a second thought? Do you kind of sit with it and think about what it really means?
Push it away as quickly as you can.
You push it away as quickly as you can. So basically, we're dancing around the more technical term that ties it back into attention. You don't process it, right? So when new information comes in, so this one I think goes more towards the fake news conspiracy theories aspect of this discussion. So let's say that somebody is on one side of a conspiracy theory and someone's on the non-conspiracy side, and the non-conspiracy side is trying to convince, the world's not flat. Yes, we landed on the moon. Pick your conspiracy theory. And the other person keeps hearing new information, new information, new information, but doesn't take the time to process that information. And because they don't take the time to process that information, the information can't do the work of changing the beliefs, being added and updated into their consolidated long-term memory. So they kind of remain insulated in their views. And that might also be one of the reasons why those groups tend to be very insular, and they tend to be very uniform, because if all of a sudden somebody, let's go with the fake moon landing. If all of a sudden somebody said, hey, you know what, I took a physics course and I actually discovered that yes, the dust actually would fall that quickly because there's no air resistance up there and the gravity is lower, so that actually is the rate at which dust would fall. So that's actually evidence that they did land on the moon, right? If you want to maintain your beliefs, then that person is an immediate out group person now, right? If they've updated their beliefs, you can't maintain yours and still say, oh yeah, you're part of us. You basically have to say, no, you're an out group person now. And because of that, I'm really not going to pay much more attention to anything else that you say. So that idea of an out group being less likely to process that information, which is like that change blindness, where we have this information coming, but we're just not going to process it, or process it at a very surface level, right? Maybe process it at a level of, well, that's from NASA, and NASA is a government organization, so that's as much as I'm going to process your information. It's from NASA, it's a government organization, they're lying, I don't want to hear any more about it. Whereas somebody else who was an in-group might say, oh, okay, that was the kind of lens they're using on the telescope, and they're shooting a laser to the mirror that they put up there, and that's how long it takes back, and they have to do, oh yeah, that's very convincing. That's a lot more processing than government, NASA, lies, we're done. Any other ideas about change blindness and how it might perpetuate, establish, or continue to maintain racism, sexism, fake news, conspiracy theories? Yep.
can obsess over little details, especially with like celebrities.
Mm-hmm.
If a celebrity wears a wig, there's going to be thousands of people who are convinced the celebrity is going into psychosis and dyeing their hair, probably.
Mm-hmm.
But most people don't notice those details. And if something accidentally comes up, you know, that it could be big. I didn't think this one has much light.
Oh yeah, no, that's fine. Not thinking things through is a great way to start thinking things through. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that you can do this both ways, right? You can kind of take a look at this and say, all right, well, in group is going to mean you process like this, and out group is going to mean you process much less. Or you can take a look at what people process, and you can say, all right, if you're processing something a lot, then you must believe that that thing is an in group. And if you process something very little, you must believe that thing is an out group. So the people who don't notice the celebrity change their wig, don't do all the little get into the analyses or anything like that, they see that celebrity as an out group, right? That person is not part of my any part of my identity. They're not part of my sort of everyday life or anything. But if you see somebody and they process a particular celebrity very, very highly, very much like identify every single detail that they do. They know where they're vacationing. They know what hairstyle they wore on their last tour, or how much they weighed for their new movie. I mean, I don't know what they obsess about necessarily. I'm more of an animation guy, so. But anyways, that would mean that on some level, they perceive that celebrity as being in group, right? So whether or not it's because of the age of the celebrity, the sex of the celebrity, maybe the job that the celebrity has, maybe they see themselves as, an aspiring singer, and this is a person that made it in their group. But whatever it is, you can use theories like change blindness and use the predictions both ways. So you can use a prediction of, well, you're in an out group, I'm going to process you less, or I'm processing you a lot, so therefore I must consider you to be part of my in group. All right, so those are some like really, really good ideas. And again, this is the kind of stuff that you want to do with especially with the cog labs that we're going to go through. I'll always try to tie them into bigger things because, as I mentioned last time, on the surface of it, most cognitive psychology experiments are incredibly trivial in terms of what they show on the surface, right? So we just went through a change detection where we showed that if you put some gray lines in between two photos, you won't notice a change, but if those gray lines are missing, you will notice a change. That again is a little magic trick that you can do. That's a little parlor trick that you could bring up at parties. However, if you can tie it into bigger things, not only are you doing the sort of cognitive work that will allow you to understand these concepts much more deeply, but you also see the importance of what it is that we're doing here and why we're looking at maybe some of these theories that might not seem to be so important, but turn out to have huge implications. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a wrap up or a look at the racism or sexism side of this. So this is a panel from Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, one of the first kind of academic intellectual treatises on what comics are. So I'll just read out the little word balloon there. When we abstract an image through cartooning, we're not so much eliminating details as we are focusing on specific details. By stripping down an image to its essential meaning, an artist can amplify that meaning in a way that realistic art can't. So here he has a very hyper-realistic, in the top left corner there, very hyper-realistic black and gray image of a man. And you can start abstracting that and turn it into a more cartoony picture of the same individual. And then you can continue that process and you can continue that process until you reach the basic fundamentals of what a human being can be abstracted to. I think if you go much below two dots and a line inside a circle, then you lose out on face. You just basically lose the ability to recognize that something is a face. However, notice what we've also kind of shown here. In the left side there, we have hyper-realistic, lots of information that you can process. Tons of information that you can process. And then as you go further to the right, much, much less information that you can actually process as to the identity of this individual. And what that means is that if you have this individual, they could be represented by that representation, by just that very simplistic, very abstracted face. However, this individual as well can still be represented by that exact same abstract face. And if we had these two individuals in a change blindness study, and you process them at this level, you process their faces at this detail, and they changed, you would notice it. You would notice the change. You would say, hey, wait a second, I was talking to the guy on the left, and now I'm talking to the guy on the right. Something weird is happening here. However, if for some reason you don't process them deep enough, you don't process enough of that information, the person on the left turns into that person in your mind. That's the level of, let's say, analysis that your attention has done on this particular individual. And the person on your right turns into this person in your mind at that level. And that's why they don't notice the change, because those in your mind are the exact same two people, because the processing just wasn't deep enough. And just to kind of leave you with a final sort of idea, one of the things that happens when people have racist ideas or stereotyped ideas is that they apply ideas generally to an entire race, to an entire sex, to an entire group. They basically say, oh, those people are like this. Those people are like this. Whereas if you're not being racist, then you don't say, oh, those people are a certain way. And maybe that has to do with in-groups and out-groups. Because if you're in-group and you're processing people like this, then if the person on the left is George and the person on the right is Scott, and George does something, you're not going to confuse that with Scott. Scott's a different person. So if George cuts you off in traffic, you're not going to say, well, you know, all men cut people off in traffic. That's just what men do, right? You'd be like, no, 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 George. George cuts people off in traffic. Scott does not. However, if you're in the out group of, for example, males, and that is your processing of George, and he cuts you off in traffic, well, guess what? Scott is exactly the same. And it's very easy to generalize between George on the left and Scott on the right. If you're an out group and you are not processing deeply enough to really put people into individual concepts, and rather you put them into categorical concepts, right? So if you're processing only enough to get a person into a category, then the only knowledge that you can apply to them is that categorical knowledge. And another way of saying that is those people are all like this, which sounds a lot like racism, sounds a lot like sexism. So one of the last things that I want to mention, or just try to pick some ideas out of this. Let's say that that's exactly the case. Let's say that's exactly the case. We hit it on the head, and we're like, okay, it's the lack of processing. It's this in-group, out-group thing that we're doing. And let's just say that you start a company and you're going to be hiring a lot of people, and you say to yourself, I'm going to make sure that this company is the least sexist, the least racist, the most inclusive, welcoming company, right? Nobody's going to be excluded. Given this information here, how might you go about doing that? Yep.
Hire all different types of people for the employing process, making sure there's a bunch of different people that are not, I think my biases are people that other people have double checked.
So your suggestion would be to hire a lot of people that are from different races, different sexes, different ethnicities, and just have them all in one area working together.
Yeah, at least like some people I can check with, because you're not always able to notice your biases.
Right. So in that case, people I think would probably call out your biases. Would that actually? Do you, how would that help if they were calling you out?
Because then I could be like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know this. I was doing that. That must have, this must be the explanation for why I did that. I'll change the way I act in the future and not do that again. Or if I was going to make a poor decision in the hiring process,
Mm-hmm.
they could say, they could call me out and say, hey, that's a good idea, and I not do the thing that I was going to do that.
Okay, so the idea, I think we got a few ideas there. One idea is that you would basically have error checking from other people to make sure that you weren't making incorrect decisions because you weren't processing information enough from potential outgroup individuals. And then the other thing that you mentioned there as well is that if you have a diverse group of individuals in an organization, then at least one person is probably going to be in group with somebody else, right? Depending upon the size of your organization, at least one individual is going to be in group with another individual. So if that second individual is not getting processed enough, if they're getting generalized, if they're getting ignored because of these basic processes, then at least you have somebody else who's an in-group person that would be able to process that information and maybe bring it to the attention of other individuals. Now, you do run into a challenge where if those two are both very in group and there isn't another person that's in group, they are amplifying the message, but they might still both get ignored. Any other? I mean, that is one way. I think it would very much reduce it. It would very much reduce it. So that would be one approach. And this is another example of this change blindness, the change blindness phenomenon and the change blindness implications doesn't just lead to one solution. I'm not saying that these two solutions would work completely or two wouldn't work, but they would be two approaches that you would want to try that would be backed by the change detection. Any other? Yep.
A completely blind interview process so that you can't see the other person. You wouldn't even be able to hear their correct voice because they're gonna have to go through like a vocal changer or whatever. So
Mhm.
that you have zero bias towards the person. Just you're sticking with the facts, the skills that they have.
Okay, so we have taking out any information that a person might be outgroup, and therefore just putting it to the point where you have no other information to go on, so you'd have to process that information. In that case, let's follow that a little bit further. What would happen when they got employed?
Then they're no longer obscured. They're just in the company. I guess doesn't matter if they're in group or out group. They pass the interview.
Okay, so they passed the interview and they got hired. So they have what is it called? I remember somebody talking about corporate culture and about making sure that you have a good culture in your organization. And they mentioned that there's a difference between being invited to the party and being asked to dance. And I just kind of feel like if you had that blind interview process, the person would get invited to the party. But if those barriers still existed when they actually started working in that company, then all of a sudden you have this instance where they're not getting invited to the dance. Maybe they're not getting on, different committees. Maybe they're not being included in other projects. Maybe their opinions are not being followed up on or not being thought about. So it is uh, it is a way to solve that initial problem, but I think you're still running into problems post hiring. All right. Any other possibilities of what to do? All right. So one last suggestion that I'll make. I mean, those are all really, really good ideas, and I think if you did put those in to implement it, it would make it better. I think, for example, in your case, you still would run into problems after the hiring process, but it definitely would be a start to making it a better, attaining that goal of not being racist, not being sexist. But one of the things to notice about this kind of processing is that this in-group, out-group processing, this is, I'm going to be very careful the way that I say this. This is basically amoral. And what I mean by that is that it's not good, it's not bad. This is the way our minds are made, right? This is the way our minds operate. And one of the things that going forward in your career as a psychologist, one of the things that you will discover and you will continually come up against is that a person's mind and the way that it operates is very, very difficult to change, right? It's very difficult to change how we treat in-group people versus how we treat out-group people. So that is just something that is ingrained into our mind. It's just the way that our minds develop. However, once you understand that and that there are in-group versus out-group people, then one of the things that you can do much more easily is you can manipulate who is in-group and who is out-group, right? So if, for example, in that company, you can say, well, you know, we are this company, we create cognitive psychology textbooks, and we are Cogco, and we are better than Macmillan. Macmillan, I think, is the people that do this textbook that we're reading. But you can say stuff like, well, we do things this way. Macmillan, they're like that, right? We do things in this way, but Macmillan, that company is different. They're the outgroup. So if you can create outgroups, then you can immediately make people in groups, and that goes a long way towards changing the attitudes and the way that people behave with each other. So the in-group, out-group thing, you're never going to get rid of it. That's one of the things. There's always going to be an out-group. There's always going to be an in-group. But the thing that you can make the biggest difference on is who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group. And the more people that you can include in an in-group, the better that processing will be, the more they'll be individuals, and the more that behavior will be consistent with the person that they are, rather than a generalization of what they might be. And that is something to notice. Now that you know this, as you watch, you know, the news, as you see what's going on in our world today, just notice how often when people are talking about individuals, do they draw that distinction between we are here and those are over there, right? This is us. We're an in-group here and those are over there. And you wonder sometimes why it's so difficult for people on either side to hear what the other side is saying. And it's just a matter of an out-group does not get processed as much as people in the in-group. All right, on that positive note, well, I guess it is positive. I mean, here's another thing that we're going to encounter in cognitive psychology a lot. There are ways that you wish your mind worked. There are ways that you are going to find out that your mind works, and you're going to say to yourself, man, it would be better if my mind didn't work that way, or society would be better, or this world would just be better if people just didn't do this. And what we're going to find is that people do that. And you're not going to be able to change that people do that thing. You can't change in-group versus out-group processing. That's always going to be a thing. But what you can then do is once you analyze and see those mechanisms, you can say, all right, well, what can I change? Can I change how people process in-groups versus out-groups? Not very easily. Can I change who's in an in-group and who's in the out-group? Much, much easier. So that is your lever that's the way to make the change, and that's where you're going to get your biggest effect. So I think that's a little bit more of a positive note to end on. All right. On that note, we are now going to start our look at perception. So change detection taught us something very important, and that is that you don't see everything. And now that we're going to take a look at perception, we're going to find out why and how your mind decides what's worth seeing at all. And one of the things that you want to remember, one of the basic ideas about perception is that perception is for a purpose. We have perception to do things. So it's not just to experience representations in our mind of the external world. It's so that we can do things like hide and go seek, find somebody that we're looking for, like navigate through a park and not hit the tree, not hit the bench, like take action on our environment. So keep that in mind as we take a look at perception. And let's just start it up with the basic idea of what is perception. So the definition of perception that we're going to be using is experience resulting from stimulation of the senses. So we have a whole bunch of senses. We got our 5 basic senses. We have more than that. But it's experiences that result as because of stimulating of those senses. So for example, on this video right here, you're having the experience of looking at a rabbit, and that is because of the stimulation of, in this case, your visual receptors, of the light coming in that is telling your mind, yes, that is a rabbit. Yes, they are enjoying some grass and they're about to run away. All right. Contrast this with experiences that you have in your mind with no stimulation of the senses, and those are called hallucinations. So we just saw an example where a real rabbit stimulated your senses. The James Stewart movie Harvey has an imaginary rabbit that is not stimulating James Stewart's character's, his name is Elwood, not stimulating Elwood's senses, and yet they still have experiences. So here's a clip from the film.
Is this all right? You sure? Well, I'll give you a hand. Rope it, don't slip. Now, you're sure this is all right? You wouldn't rather sit in the booth? Well,
Would he prefer a booth, Mr. Dad?
oh, thank you, Mr. Cracker. He seems to prefer the bar today. Well, good afternoon to you, sir.
All right, so that was an example of at least 3 hallucinations, right? So we have visual hallucinations. Elwood is hallucinating that Harvey, a 6-foot-tall rabbit, is there in the room with him. We have tactile hallucinations. You remember he reached out and he helped Harvey to his seat, actually kind of feeling that. And we had auditory hallucinations, where he actually engaged in the conversation that nobody else heard. There was no stimulation of the senses, and if you have experiences without stimulation of the senses, you are having a hallucination. All right, so we're not going to dive into hallucinations too much, but we're going to focus in on perception. And perception, very importantly, it can be correct. So sometimes you have an external reality. Well, not sometimes. Most of the times you have an external reality and your perception of that external reality is correct. So there's actually a rabbit out there in the field and you see a rabbit out there in the field. Your perception matches the external reality. Your perception is correct. However, perception can also be incorrect. So not hallucinations. You're still having an experience by the stimulation of your senses. It's just that your experience does not match reality, and that's what we call illusions. So I'm going to show you a very famous illusion right now. It's called the Müller-Lyer illusion. So taking a look at those 2 lines, how many people perceive the top line as being longer than the bottom line? So just to show of hands, if the top line looks to be longer than the bottom line. All right, does anybody believe that the bottom line looks to be longer than the top line? Does anybody believe that they look to be the same length? We have a couple of people. Okay. So I use this example here partly for a very, very important reason, partly to illustrate illusions, but also to illustrate a very different distinction between knowledge and experience. Basically, perception and your knowledge. Yep.
Were you talking about just the line specifically, or like the whole?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
the part?
Sorry. Probably. Okay. Just the line. So not the two little arrows on the end of it. So just the line in between those. So I mean, so let's just test everybody's vision real quick, including the arrows. How many people see the top as being longer than the bottom? Yeah, everybody's hand goes up. Okay, good. So our vision is great. But if you just concentrate on the line in between and not the actual arrowheads, then most people in here said that the top one looked to be longer. Some people said that they looked to be the same length. And one of the things that I wanted to use this to show is the difference between perception and the difference between knowledge. So I'm going to ask this in a different way. So let's try this. Let's say that you had to bet $20 on whether the top line was longer or whether the bottom line was longer, and you did not get to say that they were the same. Which one would you put your money on? The top or the bottom? So how many people would place their wager on the top line being longer if you're not allowed to say that they're the same? All right, we got a few more. How many people would put it on the bottom? All right, we have one or two. So that kind of shows you the difference between perception and knowledge, because in this case, most of you have probably seen this. This is a very famous illusion. You probably saw it in Intro to Psychology. If you remove the arrowheads, those two lines are actually exactly the same length. So if you draw lines down to the edges, they're parallel, those two lines, exactly the same length. However, when you have those arrowheads on the ends of those lines, the lines themselves typically do not look like this. They look more like this, where the top line actually looks to be longer than the bottom line. So this is a case where we have our external reality that the two lines are exactly the same, but we have our perception where the two lines are perceived as different. Now, at this point, I'm just going to point this out. If you're new to kind of cognitive psychology or perception psychology in general, one thing that you're going to notice in a lot of our cog labs especially is that every experiment is trying to make your mind fail. So most of the experiments are trying to set up situations where you get things wrong. So in this case, this is an illusion that is setting up a situation where what you perceive is actually wrong than what the reality is. So a question that I'll pose to everyone here is why is that? What is it about errors that tells us more about how the mind works than successes? Mm-hmm.
It shows us where we have limitations.
So it shows us where we have limitations. Okay, so that's one of the things that it does. It shows us the outer bounds of what it is that is actually possible for our minds to do. Yep.
It shows us if there's an impossible task where our mind tries to go, what our mind wants to do.
Okay, so if there's an impossible task, it shows us what our mind wants to do. So in both those cases, can anybody speculate about why that might give us more information than a success might? Yep.
Failures can show us our critical fail point while just constantly acting normal and succeeding.
Okay, so failures will show us our critical fail point. Can you elaborate on what you mean by critical fail point?
At what point does our mind fail?
Mhm.
And show what it did. Sorry.
No, it's good. I mean, you're right. You're right. It's hard. I mean, I know the feeling when you know what it is that you're trying to argue, but you just can't kind of get it out. So it's a good experience. But the critical failure. Maybe somebody else can help out. Yep.
I feel like for me, like putting it in my terms, I coach volleyball, so it's like when we lose a game, there's specific like reasons why we lost. Like maybe it was like the blocking, defense, something along those lines. So we can then work on that in practice and like work on what went wrong. But when we succeed, it's not necessarily looking at what went wrong. It's just like, oh, we won, great job, you did great at this, you did great at that. But I guess when failures, there's like more things that you can point out to get better.
Okay. So that all the things that we mentioned about you're showing the limitations, you're showing the critical fail point. Um, you kind of hit the nail exactly on the head when you mentioned that when you lose a game, there are very specific reasons. But when you win a game, it's just basically things went well, right? So this illusions here, where your mind fails, is like losing a game. And when you lose a game, like you said, very specific reason. You can point to blocking was the reason we lost, or I don't know volleyball, so passing was the reason we lost. You can point to very specific things, and it's the same thing in our minds. When we do things well, when perception is just cooking and we're perceiving everything the way that it's supposed to be doing, we might be doing that in a million different correct ways, right? There might be a million ways to solve that problem. But when we fail, there's usually only one way to fail the way that we do fail. So that lets the cognitive psychologist pick amongst those hundreds of different strategies and representations that might get us to the correct answer. When we fail, we eliminate many of those because, again, there's lots of ways to do something right, but specific failures usually are the result of specific things going wrong. And those failures, again, tell us where we can find that information. So the next time you're in a cog lab and they get frustrating, and they will get frustrating, just bear in mind, bear in mind and bear down on your mind that we're actually doing the work that cognitive psychology is made to do. And just to let you know, I mean, I've done all the cog labs just to test them out, and I've participated in some cognitive psychology experiments. I did a facial expressions, emotions experiment where it asked you to indicate which face had more happiness in it, for example. And every single time you got it right, the amount of difference in happiness between the two faces decreased. And every time you got it wrong, it increased a little bit. So eventually you were performing at the limits of your ability. And it wasn't until I had my PhD and I was teaching a learning course that I learned that that's actually a way that you can induce psychosis in animal subjects by giving them discrimination tasks where they get to the limit of their perceptual abilities. So just know that if you're getting frustrated in a cog lab, I've been right there with you. I've been in those same shoes, but getting that experience of your abilities going to their breaking point gives you a lot of insight in terms of what your abilities actually are. All right, so you've probably seen the Müller-Lyer illusion before, but perception can be incorrect through illusions. I'll give you one more example. So this is the Peanut characters, and they're crossing the street that was on the cover of the Beatles' Abbey Road album. Does anybody notice anything weird about those Peanuts characters? Yep. Yes, did I say 4?
I don't think you mentioned the number, but I thought that was supposed to be.
Oh, no. I thought for a second I didn't process Woodstock because Woodstock is outgroup and maybe I just don't identify with birds. No, so it's not that there's 5 of them, but Do those look like, so how do people do this photo? Does this look like cardboard cutouts that somebody made of the Peanuts cartoon, set them up on the road, and then took a photo of it? People don't believe that? Does it look like these are upright? Somewhat? We're getting a little bit of, okay. So it's meant to look like this, right? It's meant to look like individuals standing upright, walking on the street. And if you take a look at the Abbey Road photo from a slightly different angle, so this is right before the photo, you can see that they're actually upright human beings with human proportions about to walk across that crosswalk. On the other hand, if you take a look at this photo or this external reality from a different perspective, this is what it looks like. So I don't know if anybody had super huge heads and super small feet on your bingo card for this, but let's just move it to the side a little bit. So we have Marcy, I believe. And if you take a look at the image of Marcy there on the left, we can map features to the actual painted image that was on the street. So her nose is right there, and her hand is right there, and her foot is right there. And if you take that image there and view it from the correct perspective, then it's going to look like this. So maybe to you, I don't know, my visual system doesn't work that way, but this does not look like it comes from this. This looks very, very different than this. This looks like 4 upright cartoon characters existing in our real world. This looks like some horribly distorted pictures on the ground of those same characters. So you have external reality, and yet somehow your mind, when it perceives this illusion of these upright characters inhabiting the real world. All right, so again, external reality, much different than perception. Those are illusions. Most of the time, thankfully, we don't have that. So we are going to focus a lot on illusions when we take a look at perception, but I don't want you to think that that's most of your mind. It's just where we get the most information. So remember that your mind works really well most of the time, but it's where it fails that gives us insight into what it's actually doing. All right. So we're going to end today with a look at a very basic idea in perception, which is top-down versus bottom-up processing. And the idea of top-down versus bottom-up processing is basically the idea of where does the information for perception come from. So in bottom-up processing, the information for perception comes from the stimulus itself. Now, when we're talking about top-down and bottom-up processing, you might notice that the definition of perception is stimulation of your senses. It's an external thing stimulating your senses. So it has to come from the stimulus itself. Otherwise, it's a hallucination, right? So at the very basic idea, you have to have some bottom-up processing. But bottom-up processing is the information that comes from the stimulus itself, and the stimulus is the bottom. So when you take a look at this image here, there is information coming from this stimulus, where if you had no idea what these things were, you had never seen a horse before, you would still be able to perceive that there are 2 of these things and they're standing on the ground, and I just kind of even blew by it. You'd be able to perceive that there's 2 of these things. You wouldn't say, oh, well, that's some single entity. I've never seen these before. You'd be able to perceive, no, there's one thing there and there's a very similar other thing there. And that just comes from the stimulus itself. So bottom-up processing is the idea that you do have knowledge, so we're not going to ignore knowledge, but you have a perceptual system, and then you have a stimulus coming from the external world, and that stimulus gets fed into your perceptual system, and that's enough for perception. That's the sort of 100% version of bottom-up processing. Information comes from the stimulus, goes into the perceptual system, and that's enough for you to say, oh, okay, two things on the ground. I know what those, I can perceive those individual things. On the other hand, there's also the idea of top-down processing. And top-down processing is where information for perception comes not just from the stimulus, because remember, it has to come from the stimulus, otherwise it's a hallucination, but it also comes from higher level knowledge. And that higher level knowledge is known as the top. So let's take a look at another illusion here. So I'm going to show you a picture, a little cartoon of an individual. So take a moment to look at that individual. All right, and then hands up if you perceive a young woman in that picture. Hands up if you perceive an older woman in that picture. Okay, so for those of you that perceive an older woman in the picture, if I show you that other image there and say, okay, that left image is in the same orientation as the young woman in the center. Can you now see the young woman in the center? Okay, so everybody that was able to see the old woman, but not the young woman, can now see the young woman. Okay. And what about for the individuals that saw the young woman? If I say, well, there's an old woman in that picture, and that's her orientation right there on the right. How many of the ones that saw the young woman can now see the older woman? All right, lots of heads nodding. Okay, so in both of those cases, we had the stimulus, which is that center panel there. And it's very interesting that some people saw it one way, other people saw it the other way. But for our purposes today, what's most interesting is that when I gave you extra top-down information and said, hey, you know what, here's what the elderly woman looks like. You know, she's looking forward, parts, you know, the thing that is on her neck, that's actually the mouth. Once you had that extra information, then all of a sudden you were able to perceive that external reality. And depending upon which information you were given, you could change your perception of what it was that you were looking at. So that's a very nice example of top-down processing. Because in top-down processing, you still have your stimulus. You have to have the stimulus. And that stimulus gets fed into your perceptual system. But in addition to that stimulus, you have knowledge coming down from your higher cognitive processes. And that knowledge coming from the top is your top-down processing, and that is what leads you to your perception. All right, so those are the two types, bottom-up processing and top-down processing. And there was, in the history of perception research, there was a very heated debate as to how much of our perception is top-down versus bottom-up. And in the history of perception, there have been viewpoints that have gone, no joke, 100% top-down, right? Saying that the stimulus that you have is completely ambiguous and there's no way that you could perceive anything in this world unless you had stuff coming in from the top, information coming top down. And then there are other approaches that say 100% bottom up. Everything that you need is coming from the stimulus. Maybe you have to apply your knowledge to know what it means, right? Like a stop sign, but you can still perceive everything about the object with just the bottom up processing. So one of the questions, it's not as heated a debate as it used to be. You would 100% be an in-group or an out-group person, depending upon your position on top-down versus bottom-up processing. I would say probably in the 60s and 70s was when it decreased or started to decrease. But anyways, one of the things we're going to take a look at today is how much of perception is bottom-up versus top-down, and specifically how the two might interact. So I'll give you a few more examples so we can kind of get a survey of the land in terms of top-down versus bottom-up processing. So we're going to take a look at a painting by an artist called Al Held. And this is a painting of a very famous object. And I'll show you the painting. It's right here. And I'm going to put it on a black background so it's a little bit easier to see. All right, so that's the painting right there. Can anybody identify what that is a painting of? Okay, so we got nobody guessing. I'll give you yep. It is the letter N. Okay, have you seen this one? Okay, well, very nicely done. So that is a really rare example of bottom-up processing because you were able to guess it straight off the bat. Does anybody else see the N? Does anybody still not see the N? Okay, if you're still struggling to see the N, there it is right there. So you can see that little black triangle at the top, little black triangle at the bottom is what defines this as being an N. This painting is actually titled The Big N. And it's something that you've seen hundreds of times. You've seen this like at least 10 times, right? No, you've seen the N today. And yet still, when you have this information, usually most of us need top-down processing in order to do it. Most of the time, students cannot see the N until I tell them the title of this is The Big N. So in that case, we have this case here, which is a nice example of a lot of top-down processing because you need the information. You might even need to be shown where it is, where the N is, before you can all of a sudden see it and say, oh, okay, there it is. There's the big N, which was the point of this painting's impact, right? You were supposed to take a look at this painting and say, well, what is that painting? And then you take a look at the title card and you're like, oh, there it is. All right. So that's an example of top-down processing. Let's take a look at another perception example. So in this example, we have the illusion of the broken pencil. So you put a pencil in water, and the pencil is going to look like it's disjointed, like it's broken into two. So does everybody agree that that pencil looks like it's broken? Okay, we all know that it's not broken, but it looks like it's broken. Okay, so it looks like it's broken. And what I'm going to do right now is we're going to go through a very basic physics example of why this pencil looks broken. So why it looks broken. So here we have a schematic of the pencil in the water. So you can see that the pencil there in the darker yellow is solid. However, because the refraction of light is different in water than it is in the air, what happens is that the light that is reflecting off of the bottom of the pencil there, where it has an X in the jar, that light, that light just disappeared. That light, as it travels in a straight line until it gets to the intersection of the water and the air. And then when that medium changes, the light refracts and it moves in a second direction. And that's just physics. Light moves at different speeds in different mediums, so it refracts when it moves into the air. So that is the refraction of light. However, we don't have a visual system that is built with the ability to do these calculations. We have a visual system that thinks that the light is traveling in straight lines. So when this light here is coming into our eyes, our perceptual system, our visual system says, oh, that light came in a straight line. So it extrapolates that the endpoint has to be there at Y, and then you end up with a bent perception of a pencil. So is that clear to everybody? That makes sense? Everybody understands the refraction of the light and that it's not moving in straight lines, but you're assuming that it's moving in straight lines? Okay, so what I want you to do now is I want you to take all of that knowledge that I just gave you, all of that top-down information, and I want you to apply it as hard as you possibly can to the pencil in the water and see if you can get that pencil to look straight. All right, and here we go. Okay, was anybody able to do it? Hands up if you were. Everybody's hand is down. Yep, okay, you can. It's not possible, right? It's just, I've given you perfect information. That sounds very arrogant. I've given you more than enough information to explain what is going on here, and yet we still couldn't change our perception of it the way that we changed our perception of the big N. So this is an example here of bottom-up processing. So the information for the perception of this stimulus is coming from the stimulus itself, and whether I change your top-down processing or not, it's not going to change the way that that actually looks. All right, last example that we're going to take a look at. This is a painting by Bev Doolittle, and it is called Pintos. So my question for everyone here, does everybody see horses? Okay, take a minute and count up how many horses. All right, everybody have their number? Okay, so I don't remember what I counted up before, but I'm looking at it right now and I see 5 horses. Does everybody see? Yeah? So I'm not too far off? Okay, cool. So if you don't see 5 horses, nobody sees 6 horses, right? Okay. If you're missing a horse, we have a horse right here, so that's the head of one horse. And then we have a horse right here, that's the head of the second horse. And then we got a horse right here, that's number 3. And then we got number 4 up here. And then we got the little baby horse over here, and that is number 5. Or
there's no like indication on.
okay. Let's try that again. I had my own hallucination on this one. Okay, yeah, I was wondering, like, okay, so there we go. There's horse head number 1. There's horse head number 2. Horse head number 3. Horse head number 4. And there's little baby horse head number 5. And I was going to make a joke that the easiest way to do this is to just count up the legs and divide by 4, but no, I don't want to. All right. So in this case, this is an example where the artist intentionally made this difficult to bottom-up process on its own, right? She intentionally chose the horses, chose the environment, so that there's a lot of confusion between the two. So you might get 3 horses from bottom up, right? You might be able to do that, but eventually you might have to sit there and go, okay, well, wait a second. Let me think about what I know about a horse. Let me think about what I know about the dimensions of a horse and how horses stand and you know, information that I know about horses. And you might have to apply that top-down information to this picture to help you figure out where every single horse is. So this is a nice case of interaction between bottom-up and top-down processing. So we have the bottom-up processing that comes from the image itself, and we can get to maybe 2, 3, 4, 2, 3 horses. But to maybe get them all, we have to start thinking about, well, that one has to be a rock because of what I know about rocks, and that's got to be a horse because of what I know about horses. So horses' heads are connected to horses' necks, which are connected to horses' legs, and that means that entire area is a horse. So that's an example of a combination between that top-down and bottom-up processing. All right. So any questions on top-down versus bottom-up or what we've seen so far? Okay. So what we're going to do today to wrap this up is we're going to take I'm going to leave you with another challenge, and we'll pick this up next time when we meet. And the question I'm going to pose to you is, why are some stimuli mostly bottom up? And why do some seem to be mostly top down? And why do some seem to be mixed? So this is an example of one that seems to be mixed, a little bit of top down, a little bit of bottom up. This is an example of one that seemed to be all bottom up. And then we had this one over here, which seemed to have a large amount of top down processing. So the question that I'm going to leave you to think about, speculate, is what is different about these pictures that causes some of them to be perceived with almost completely bottom-up processing, and other ones to only be perceived when there is a lot of top-down processing involved. So try to tease out what is the deciding factor between those, and we will dive into that to finish up our look at top-down and bottom-up processing. Are there any final questions before we wrap up for today? All right, so that is it for today.